My name is Mickey Pascoe and I'm one of the co-founders of Little Acre Gourmet Mushrooms in Brisbane. We are a gourmet mushroom farm primarily. We produce around 300 to 400 kilos of fresh mushrooms per week, and we have also moved into spawn production, which is an input in growing. So we supply a lot of small farms around Australia with mushroom spawn, and we've moved into grow kits and growing supplies. So we've got multiple avenues of the company running at once, and we're doing this all out of our facility in Brisbane. So Little Acre Gourmet Mushrooms is a mushroom farm in Brisbane, and we focus on the gourmet mushroom variety. So very different from your agaricus mushrooms that you find at the supermarkets, which are the traditional button mushrooms. We focus on the multitude of other varieties, and they're typically known as gourmets or exotic mushrooms. So you can be thinking of oyster mushrooms and shiitake mushrooms when we're talking about these types of mushrooms. And we first started back in 2017. We just got given a mushroom grow kit, typically just like the ones that we actually produce now around Australia. We got given one of those, and my field before mushrooms was in marine science, so I had a science background, and we got given one of these grow kits. And a typical grow kit, you open up the box and it comes with a spray bottle, and you spray water on it and the mushrooms come out of the box. And I was fascinated of how they got something that's a living organism wrapped up inside a cardboard box, and when you're ready to start it, it would start growing. So that fascinated me, and we started researching into mushrooms and how to grow mushrooms ourselves, and that led us to do a couple of workshops. And this was in 2017 in Brisbane, when the fine dining scene for restaurants really started to start growing, and we knew a few chefs in that scene, and we started asking them would they be interested in these gourmet mushrooms that you typically can't find in the supermarkets or through a wholesale network, and they were very interested. So we did some workshops on how to grow. We created a really small setup under our house, and we just started experimenting if we could grow our own mushrooms. And once we realized that we could, and we had some skills developed that we could grow some of these more specialty varieties, we basically went all in with some shipping containers and basically designed a small mushroom farm in inner city Brisbane. And we just took it bit by bit. I kept my job, and my co-founder Amy started working more full-time in the business, and we started everything from scratch. And we were just learning typically from books and through the internet, because there's very little expertise in gourmet mushrooms traditionally in Australia. A lot of the expertise for this sort of thing is coming out of Asia and across the United States. And so we were just learning bit by bit and producing these mushrooms and making every mistake you could possibly make. But because of the fine dining scene booming in Brisbane, we started to get multiple restaurant accounts over and over, and it just helped us to grow the company in that way. So during COVID, of course, we lost a lot of our restaurant accounts, but fortunately we had moved into other avenues of the business. As we started to evolve the business, we got a demand for grow at home kits, but also for workshops and education. So we started to fill this niche where people wanted to learn how to grow mushrooms for themselves, but also to start their own small businesses. And so as the restaurants dropped away, we started building more of that part of the business up. We started producing grow kits, but also leaning more into growing supplies and education through workshops and mushroom spawn for commercial mushroom farms. So as the business has evolved, it's evolved at the beginning to be a fresh mushroom farm that started to transition into us becoming mushroom educators in the space of growing your own mushrooms at home. So the mushroom industry in Australia has been based primarily around the agaricus mushrooms, which are your button mushrooms, your fields, and your Swiss browns. This is all just one species, and this has been the primary species that has dominated the supermarkets over the last 40 to 50 years. And since more information has come from overseas in gourmet mushroom production, we have seen a small increase in this sort of supply, but majority of these are just imported gourmet mushrooms from Korea and China. And so these are mushrooms typically like shiitake and king oyster that have a large and a long shelf life. So these mushrooms are imported into Australia and are sort of supplementing the agaricus mushroom industry. So we've got a very, very small gourmet mushroom industry. Even though consumer demand is increasingly growing, we don't have any real support network for gourmet mushroom producers, and that's where we've sort of stepped into this space, becoming educators of gourmet mushrooms, but also providing the supplies and the tools and the equipment to sort of start these small enterprises up, to sort of provide people not only with their own small businesses, but also consumers to have exotic mushrooms for their table. So over the last few decades, gourmet mushrooms have become more mainstream. They've become more through social media, marketing, and through cuisines overseas. People have started to explore these different mushrooms, and also the rise of the medicinal sides of the mushrooms. So people are always looking for health benefits, and mushrooms have incredibly strong medicinal qualities. And so there's a range of different mushrooms that people can grow at home, but also take themselves through different products that you can get over the counter. And this has led to more and more interest on how can I also grow these mushrooms at home. So the culinary side coupled with the medicinal side has seen an increase in this section. Traditionally in the supermarket, you've got a huge array of vegetables and fruit, but in the mushroom area, there's really just the button mushrooms. And so it's really one of the last categories left in the fresh supermarket, which is there that consumers are demanding more variety, because there's such a plethora of different fungi that you can get, but it's not on the shelves. And so over the last few years, we've seen a demand for that, and we've experienced that through workshops. So there's ever increasing demand for people and consumers to learn how to grow their own mushrooms, but also for people to start their own businesses to fill that niche where the major supermarkets haven't got the supply. So everyone should be eating more mushrooms. Mushrooms are extremely high in dietary fiber. They're a high source of protein. They're a fantastic alternative to animal protein, but also they're really high in a lot of medicinal qualities, beta-glucans, but also vitamin B and vitamin D. Mushrooms are one of the only things that you can consume as a food source to get vitamin D. Apart from going out and standing out in the sun, vitamin D can become from mushrooms, and that's because the fungi kingdom is closely related to the animal kingdom. And so mushrooms have melanin in their tissues, which interacts with UV light and produces the vitamin D in the tissues of the fungi. And so as we consume that, we're absorbing the vitamin D. So it's a fantastic source of vitamin D into diets, but also as plant-based diets have evolved over the last decade or so, more and more alternatives can be found in the fungi kingdom and through eating gourmet mushrooms. They've got extremely great texture, a whole range of different flavors, and it's allowing you to create cuisines that you can't typically create with traditional agaricus or button mushrooms, but also vegetables. So mushrooms have high amounts of chitin in their tissues, which allows them to not break down through a lot of heat. If you heat it up, for instance, vegetables in boiling water, they'll turn to mush because they've got a cellulose as their structure. But for mushrooms, they use chitin, and so the chitin holds it together. So they act very similar to animal proteins. So it's a fantastic source for consumers in the kitchen. And this is where we're seeing this demand. We're seeing people that want gourmet mushrooms in their diets, and we're seeing people that want to cook with them because they can create fantastic dishes. So through the evolution over the years, we've seen a demand for gourmet mushrooms. And so it's really leading Australia into a place where the consumers want more gourmet mushrooms. And so we're trying to provide that through education, but also supporting businesses across Australia. So some of the major challenges in the gourmet mushroom industry moving forward is that dominance of the agaricus industry in Australia. A lot of that is produced in a specific way, and that way is not translated over to gourmet mushroom production. Agaricus mushrooms are grown on a mixture of manure and peat, and they're known as secondary feeders. So those mushrooms are actually growing and consuming the bacteria in that bed, whereas gourmet mushrooms are saprophytic mushrooms, and they consume the cellulose and lignin from sawdust. And so those two areas don't really translate very well. And because of this, the industry is dominated by the sector, which is the agaricus industry. And it really leaves, it's difficult for the smaller gourmet mushroom producers to sort of move into this industry. Because the industry is dominated by these large agaricus growers, there's really a lack of information and the sharing of information for gourmet mushroom production. Because they're not focused on that area, we find that there's a real void for how to produce these mushrooms. When we first started, there was only a couple of books in Australia and very few supporting businesses or networks to be able to learn how to grow these mushrooms. And so because of this, we just see the lack of produce in the supermarket because of this reflection of the lack of knowledge. Because there's no knowledge here of how to grow these species, it just leads to fewer and fewer producers, and it's really left to a few individuals to learn via the internet and a few books on how to produce these mushrooms. So because that industry is really a closed loop where the spawn production and the growing supplies and the growers are sort of work together on that sort of area, it leaves the smaller growers for gourmet mushrooms sort of seeking out information and products and spawn to produce their own mushrooms. And that void is what we have, we were involved in it, and we started to act on that and produce and learn how to produce our own spawn to support not only ourselves but also smaller growers to help grow the gourmet mushroom industry. So that is one of the biggest challenges, is the lack of information. Another challenge is the type of produce that we're producing is a highly perishable product. Australia is a huge continent and it's got a very variable temperature, and so to transport a perishable product that needs cold refrigerated transport is extremely difficult. So there needs to be a greater network of growers across the country to basically fill that void of these highly perishable but also fragile items. So these gourmet mushrooms are not great for logistical transport, and so the best way to get substantial supply across a country such as Australia is by supporting a lot of small independent growers, and that's where we've sort of stepped into that space to support growers in their knowledge but also in the supply chain. So the aim for my Churchill project was to go overseas to gather this information that's necessary into growing the gourmet mushroom industry in Australia. We've got a lot of countries overseas that have been growing a number of these mushrooms for decades, if not centuries, and so their knowledge of how to produce these mushrooms, because each one of these species have nuances, they have differences in how to produce them, all the way from the cloning and tissue culturing of the fungi species up through the fruiting of the fruiting bodies and then the transport of these products. So to help grow the industry in Australia, we really have to look overseas and see what information is available overseas and bring that back to Australia to help grow the network of knowledge here, and also to be able to produce the growing supplies and the materials at a high quality so that the growers and the people that are fruiting these mushrooms have the highest available produce to go to market with. So this information is really necessary because without it, it's really difficult for us as an industry to grow in this sector. There's more and more species that are being trialed, and the growing techniques are being developed overseas, and this collective body of information is not in Australia. And so for Australia to have the same offerings that other parts of the world have in gourmet mushrooms, which is, like we said, an extremely valuable input into a diet through its fiber, protein, plant-based diets, its medicinal qualities, the vitamin D content of these mushrooms, all of these things are attributed back to having a really strong industry. And to get a strong industry, we need to go and gain some of this knowledge overseas, where these companies have really focused in and honed on how to grow these mushrooms in a certain way. And by gaining that information, we can help grow this industry, which will give consumers a greater variety of choice at the supermarket. So my Churchill project was undertaken around the world in 3 main areas. The first area was Japan. Japan has a rich cultural history with mushrooms, and a lot of the species that we grow have originated in Japan, and these have been grown using modern techniques for decades, and they've been using mushrooms in their culture for centuries. So by going to Japan was helping us understand how some of these more specialty varieties grow and how to grow them in an environment for high consumer demand, because the Japanese consume a lot of mushrooms as part of their diet. So it was really interesting to see that part of the industry. So the second part of the trip was going across Europe and seeing how these mushrooms have been grown across a range of different countries. Europe is known as another high producer of agaricus mushrooms. A lot of the technology for agaricus production has come from Europe through their agri-tech and protective cropping areas. And so they're also working on a lot of technology for the production of gourmet mushrooms at scale. So we were going across Europe to sort of explore these areas and seeing how they're taking mushrooms that are traditionally from Asian countries and producing them on a large scale for Europe. And the third part of the trip was going across the United States. The US is very similar in the gourmet mushroom scene to Australia, except they're 5 to 10 years ahead of the Australian scene. The United States has a large network of smaller gourmet mushroom producers, which is sort of what is sort of developing in Australia. So we were going to the US to sort of see how they're producing these mushrooms on in a network sort of setup, but also how they're educating consumers. The demographic in the United States is similar to Australia, and so how are they approaching education to consumers? How are they approaching displaying these products in a retail environment? So we visited not only fresh mushroom production across the US, but also the growing supplies and the spawn production, and seeing how these parts of the industries interact with each other, which is similar to how the Australian setup is coming. And so these three areas form the basis for the trip as we explored how gourmet mushroom production is being done overseas. So our first stop on our trip was Singapore. Singapore we chose because it was a jumping off point as we were traveling towards Japan. Singapore was a really interesting country because it is so urban and such a small island. They are importing a lot of the produce and food into the country, and so you would think that it would be an ideal area for gourmet mushroom production, which is an indoor cropping process and can be done easily in an urban environment. But we found that there is a very few growers in Singapore, and this is down to a lack of a network. And this highlighted this to us as we found one grower who invited us in, Kiet from Bewilder, and he showed us his small urban farm, and he was finding it difficult because he had to go down a very rigorous permit process to be able to do any sort of urban farming in Singapore through their rules. And so their laws and regulations preventing him from establishing an urban farm easily. And so he was jumping through those hoops. So he showed us his small setup, and because of these regulation and rules and because of a lack of a network, he was finding it difficult to solely rely on the production of fresh mushrooms and produce. So he was moving more into also an art side of the production of mushrooms, using mushrooms to produce biomaterials and fabrication, and using basically the mycelium of the structure of the mushrooms to create these different products. And that allowed him to have a sustainable business in Singapore. He was displaying and talking to us about the lack of a network in Singapore for this area, but the consumer demand is high. They have a really strong culture consuming mushrooms, and a lot of their cuisines call for mushrooms. So they import a lot of their mushrooms into the country, but a network or an establishment of some more information would allow the growth of a business model in Singapore that is currently lacking. So that was our first stop during our world mushroom trip. Japan was an amazing part of the trip where we got to experience how mushrooms are grown on scale. A lot of the growers in Japan focus on just one variety of mushrooms, whereas in Australia and other parts of the world, such as the US, a lot of smaller growers, to sustain their businesses, they grow a multitude of different varieties. Whereas in Japan, because of the culture of mushrooms and the economy of mushrooms, a lot of growers just focus on a single variety. And so we connected with Salai International, and they're a body which is basically taking the technology and the knowledge from growers in Japan and taking that to the world. And so through them, we connected with Jake, and he showed us around Japan on a number of different growers and seeing how they grow different mushrooms. One of our first stops was a farm called Sukiono, which was a couple of hours outside of Tokyo, and they primarily produce shiitake mushrooms, but they also as we got there and started to understand their business, they also produced beetles for the beetle trade. So in here we're starting off with the shiitake blocks. So these blocks are being put into this room after they've been inoculated, and they're going to incubate. And they're going to incubate until they turn white and then brown. And we can see some of the mycelium working its way through the blocks here. So these are all top spawned blocks, unlike other areas of the world which they shake their blocks. These are all top spawned and let to sit here. Then they're stacked up, and you can see these blocks are turning white, and they are left in here for around 3 months for the mycelium to develop before they're ready to fruit. And interestingly, this farm using some blue lighting here to help encourage mycelial growth. Then across into the shiitake fruiting room here. So once the shiitake blocks are ready to fruit, they'll be placed in a room at around 92% humidity and a cooler around 18 degrees. And this will encourage the mushrooms to fruit, and you can see the mushrooms popping out here, and this is the first flush for these blocks. Now in Japan, it's one of the only countries that does multiple flushes on a shiitake block, and to encourage more flushes you need to soak and rehydrate the block. So that's what's being done here. After the mushrooms are picked, they're stacked into these bins and soaked with water. And Japan does this because their labour is quite cheap, and so it's very labour intensive, as you can see, stacking and loading blocks. And so they do actually second and third flushes of shiitake blocks at this facility. Then across into the packing room, this facility grades its mushrooms in 21 different grades depending on different markets, and it's done using this amazing machine which uses the weight and also a laser to determine the shape of the mushroom, and they're automatically graded here for the markets. The other part of this industry in this business here is the beetle trade, which we only discovered when visiting this farm. And you can see here this amazing looking Hercules beetle from South America. Now he's popping it on a stick because these ones can bite, but it's an amazing industry in Japan where this is essentially for the pet market of all different types of amazing looking large beetles that people keep. Now the reason that a mushroom farm is producing these products is because the beetle larvae eat mycelium. Over here you can see this is actually a North Queensland rainbow beetle here. It's an amazing looking beetle from Australia. But the beetle larvae in the wild, they live in the understory in the leaf litter under trees, and they consume mycelium. And you can see here in this bottle the patchiness. So the white is the mycelium, and the patchiness is where the grub or the larvae has worked its way through that little bit of substrate eating the mycelium. And the beetle larvae can live in these bottles for up to a year, basically consuming it. So it's their food source. So a mushroom producing facility that produces mycelium is the perfect facility to produce this for this trade. And you can see the little larvae in there consuming the mycelium. So it's up to 30% of the revenue of this company is working into this beetle market. And you can see here on the packing room floor, all of these boxes on the Monday morning are going out for online orders for beetles. So substrates, beetles, beetle eggs, and all the materials that you need. And this is some sterilized substrate, perfectly made for this market. So really interesting to see this coming out of this facility in Japan. Just another thing that you can produce in a mushroom farm. Our second stop headed towards the Fuji prefecture, visiting the Fuji Mushroom Center, which was a very small farm using some bottle technology. You see bottle cultivation in a lot of large farms, but we got to see this in a very small family setup with Mount Fuji in the background of their mushroom farm. So in this small facility here, they had some really old technology producing mushrooms in bottles. So bottles are a fantastic way to avoid using the disposable plastic bags that are seen in a lot of farms. But to invest in that technology takes a lot of money because of the scalability. But this is a very small farm that had a little bit of the tech here, and they're using it to produce mushrooms within these bottles here. And so these bottles are actually being opened up and ready for the fruiting phase of the mushrooms. So from the top here, when the caps are removed, you've got the white mycelial growth here. And this is disturbed and scraped away to encourage the mycelium to produce mushrooms in these bottles. So once the mycelium is ready to fruit, these bottles are then placed into a fruiting room where they're allowed to develop the different mushrooms. And so inside this fruiting room here, we had a range of different mushrooms. We had the king oyster, Pleurotus orangii, and we also saw some oyster mushrooms, so Pleurotus austriatus. So over here we've got the king oysters here producing their typical shape straight from the bottles here. And then over on this rack here we had some fantastic clusters of this really beautiful dark charcoal-y looking oyster mushroom. And so this mushroom strain had been developed for bottle cultivation, where it can produce a fantastic beautiful cluster straight from the top, and then these are harvested, and then the bottles are then reused in the system to produce more mushrooms for many years. So across on the factory floor we see a similar sorting machine again, but this one is just using weight, and so the mushrooms are placed on the little scales in there, and the computer weighs them and grades them into the different bins here. So grading shiitake based on different weights and different sizes is very typical in Japan, where they've got a very educated consumer base for mushrooms. Another side part of this company was also the production of dried mushrooms. So there's no waste here. Any trimmings or offcuts for the mushrooms are then put into a dryer and dried, and you can see out here in the sun they start off the drying process in the sun, and then that's moved into a drying machine. So trying to utilize everything that they can to try and produce revenue for their business. Now this was located in the Fuji prefecture, and the owner very much wanted to show off his location, so we stepped up around here just on the side of their building. It was an amazing day when we visited, and just on the side here in front of this little tea plantation you can see Mount Fuji in the background, which was really incredible to see with the offset of the small little mushroom farm in the background. As part of our trip to Japan, we wanted to see firsthand the traditional log cultivation of shiitake mushrooms. Japan's one of the last places in the world which traditionally cultivates shiitake mushrooms commercially on logs, and so we went to the Fuji Shuken Center with Mr. Iba, who has over 35 years experience producing high quality mushroom strains for log cultivation. These are a range of shiitake mushrooms, and they produce their own cultures and their own sawdust spawns. So we get to see the spawn creation in their facility, but also how they translate to the logs that they source for log cultivation. And so they're using oak logs here for their shiitake production, and they're drilling the holes getting ready for inoculation. So the first technique is to drill the holes. You times the diameter by 7, and that will tell you how many holes to be drilling in your log. So you want an even distribution of holes across the log, and this is where the sawdust spawn will be added into these logs to create the amazing shiitake mushrooms. So once the holes have been drilled in these logs, they are then inoculated, and they're inoculated using a hand technique, or they are more automatic machinery that you can use. But here is a small hand tool which they've developed, and it's filled up with sawdust spawn, and then a skilled operator basically inserts that into the hole and squeezes a small plug of sawdust shiitake spawn into the logs. So there's a bit of skill that gets needed for this, and so I had to have a go, and it's a lot more difficult than it looks. So you've got to line up the gun towards the hole at the right angle so that you are continually refilling the plunger as you're inoculating the log. And so you want to have all of the holes around this log inserted with the sawdust spawn for shiitake. After that, you need to seal the holes to stop evaporation, and they use paraffin wax mixed with pine resin, and then that is dabbed onto all the holes here. Then it's just a simple process of basically keeping the logs moist for around 3 to 4 months, and you will start to see little baby shiitake mushrooms producing. And so you can see here they are coming out of these logs, and log grown shiitake is regarded as a much higher quality mushroom. You're going to get much more consistent, beautiful fruits, and these can flush and fruit for several years given the correct conditions. So similar technique and premise as growing mushrooms on sawdust, but because it's such a dense log, it takes a lot longer for the mycelium to break down the timber, and so you get a lot longer crop, but it takes a while for those mushrooms to start producing if you want to have that growing. And we are seeing here just the quality that we're looking at. This is the most incredible shiitake mushrooms we've ever seen in the world. They are really large and perfectly shaped. This one weighed around 50 grams for a single shiitake mushroom, which would be an almost impossible feat on a sawdust block. And so this is an incredible strain that they've developed, and you can see here just the consistency and the veil coming away from that cap there, producing an amazing mushroom. They also produce strains for traditional blocks here, and you can see these sawdust blocks here. So we got to see a range of different growing techniques at this facility, all for shiitake mushrooms. So it was amazing seeing the experts in action and how to really grow truly the world's greatest shiitakes. So we saw small scale bottle technology getting done by the Fuji Mushroom Center, but we went to also Fuji High Tech that are producing Nameko mushrooms on extremely large scale in bottle technology. So we got to see their plant where they produce around 3 tons of Nameko mushrooms per day with a staff of around 20 employees, and this is all done through advanced technology and growing in a really controlled environment. So we have a bottle plant here on a much larger scale, and you can see these trays here, they're all stacked up just like previously seen, but on a much bigger scale. Now these are all containing Nameko mushrooms, so you've got a warehouse here, and it's got immense cooling that's happening here to be able to keep the climate stable with all of these mushrooms incubating in this space together. And as we're going through the farm, we're starting to see different stages. This is where the Namekos are just starting to pin here in these very, very large, highly humid grow rooms here that are around 100% humidity. So you can see the water on the floor here. And this is the Nameko mushroom, a very famous Japanese mushroom. And you can see very, very, very consistent growth on every single bottle here. So they've really mastered the growth of these mushrooms, and this facility only produces this mushroom. And so you've got beautiful orange clusters on top of all of these racks here, and they're using robots to basically bring all of these racks down for harvest. You can see there an amazing bunch of Nameko mushrooms. So these are all here very, very consistent, and we're just at the stage here of when these will be going for harvesting. So there's all automatic harvesting machines and weighing machines, so this is how they're able to produce such large quantities with such fewer employees. And these machines grade and sort and pack all of these mushrooms into these very small little packets here, little 100-gram packets for your miso soup, and they produce around 1/27th of the daily consumption for Japan's Nameko, and they're producing 3 tons. So that's an extreme amount of mushrooms for just this species across the whole of the country, but facilities like this allow for very high production of Nameko mushrooms. Our final stop in Japan was visiting the Miyogi maitake farm. Maitake, traditionally a Japanese mushroom, is newly cultivated elsewhere around the world, and so we really wanted to explore and see how these mushrooms are produced. They're highly specialty and have got a lot of specialty techniques that are needing to be able to produce them successfully. So we went and visited the Miyogi mushroom farm, where they're producing around 1 ton of fresh maitake per day with only 30 kilos of seconds. So they're highly experienced in that. And one of the key parts in how they produce maitake is they're using spent shiitake logs in their substrates, using around 30% spent shiitake logs into their substrates, producing the maitake blocks. So once the shiitake logs produce all the shiitakes they can produce, they then grind these up and mix about 30% of this into the mixture for maitake production. And this is because maitake find it hard to digest the cellulose and lignin, so it's a better mix if you mix a bit of shiitake pre-digested wood into the block. Here you can see the maitake are starting to pin and form on top of these blocks. These, the way they're getting these amazing clusters is they're concentrating the pin set all into one specific location on the block. Now this is a technique that is very much seen in Japan, and it allows you to get these amazingly large clusters of maitake here. So you've got these really dark fruits forming because we've got additional UV light that's being added into the room to encourage a high amount of melanin in the tissue and allowing you to have this really dark coloration. So all of these blocks are just single harvested, so once they produce one bunch of mushrooms they're then disposed of, but each one is crafted to produce a really great bunch of maitake mushrooms. So you've got amazing fronds here of the maitake, also called hen of the woods because of these sort of feather-like appendages that the maitake produces. So these are all ready to harvest at this point, and once that's happened, we also saw what happens to the spent substrate and the bags. So at this facility we were quite surprised. They're actually burning their plastic bags to get rid of them. As you can see, there's a large quantity of these, and so they use a machine here where they put some bags that are ready to be disposed of, and this machine strips off the plastic and then disposes the sawdust into a pile, which is then collected and disposed of. But the plastic, they're actually burning this to produce heat, to heat their rooms around the farm. So something that we really wouldn't expect of the burning of plastic, but this farm is doing that, and they saw no real harm in doing such a technique. So just different processes around the world of how to dispose of waste products that we saw here. And then these maitake blocks are then taken into the fresh maitake are taken into the packing room, and they're packed through all automatic machinery and sent out to market. So a really efficient way of producing a high quality mushroom here in Japan is the Miyogi mushroom farm. The Japanese leg of the trip was an incredible part of gaining a lot of information that you just can't simply get from books or the internet. A lot of this information is passed down through generations, because a lot of these farms are generation after generation that are owning them. And so it was an incredible part of our experience to visit Japan and visit these specific growers, where we had got the chance to go and speak to them through Jake, through Salai International, and talk to them about their specific growing techniques and be able to get that information and share that back in Australia. So as we headed across to Europe, we went into Germany and we visited a number of farms in Germany, not only producing fresh mushrooms, but also producing the substrates for mushroom production. So we visited Plitzgarten and Biomycotech, and we visited Torsten, a very experienced grower, and they are producing mostly king oysters, but also shiitake mushrooms. So Torsten was very kind of showing us around Biomycotech and Plitzgarten, and you can see here the blocks are in baskets getting ready to be put into these autoclaves here. So they're producing substrate blocks not only for their own mushroom farm, which is Plitzgarten, but they're also producing substrate blocks to send around Europe to supply the demand of mushroom farms that require sterilized and inoculated mushroom blocks. And so these are getting ready to be put into the autoclaves, and then once that's happened, then they're cooled down and inoculated. On the other end of the inoculating room, we've got a mixing machine here where you can see it's tumbling, and these bags are basically put through a tumbler, and what this is doing is distributing the grain spawn that's added into these bags. So a very big difference between Japan and other parts of the world is most other parts of the world use grain spawn instead of sawdust spawn, and grain spawn allows for a faster inoculation, but you need to shake the grain through the substrate, allowing you to have more inoculation points through the bag. And this will give you a faster substrate. It'll become ready to colonize and ready to fruit a lot quicker, but it also needs additional labor, and you need additional equipment, such as they're using a tumbling machine, and then once they're tumbled they need to be straightened up and put onto racks, and so it's a little bit more labor intensive than what you see in Japan. Once they are ready to fruit, they're then put into their fruiting rooms, very similar to what we saw in Japan, where they've got large fruiting rooms here and with the humidity around 92%. And so you can see some great shiitakes running off all of these blocks. So they do really large rooms, and they basically fill this room up in one go, allow all the mushrooms to fruit at once, they harvest them all, and then all of the substrates removed off site. So they do one flush and then the room is cleaned down, allowing you to put another flush of blocks in. So they don't do second and third flushes in Europe because of the high labor costs, and so they just get the first flush of the shiitake mushrooms, which is, you get the most from a first flush and you'll get little amounts from the second and third, so that's not economical for them to do so here. You can see some great shiitake blocks all throughout this room. Over here is the king oyster room, and they're loading up this room again all at once. Then they're going to harvest and then remove all the substrate. They put a conveyor belt down the middle of the room to allow you to fill this room as quickly as possible, and these guys are removing the tops of the bags, allowing the mushrooms to fruit out. And so in the king oyster room, you can see here a lot of pin sets of the king oysters coming out, and they are one of the larger producer of this mushroom. It's a very high yielding mushroom, and it's also got a very high shelf life, so they like to produce this mushroom. And very simple racks again in this room, where you've just got a large room with these wire racks down the sides, and then they're putting these blocks on there, allowing you to have the mushrooms fruit out as easily as possible. Then they're all harvested at once. And so this room is quite large. They would say that they would prefer it to be slightly smaller if they could do it again, because obviously it takes a lot of labor to pick all of these mushrooms at once and then to clean the room down. But great to see this in Germany. We also visited Jürgen Nast. The facility that he is running is producing a lot of substrates which are then bought by other farms. This is a very different proposition than is currently being done in Australia, where there's such a lack of a network in Australia. There's no environment where small growers can purchase ready to make fruiting blocks or substrates, which is something that the area that we're getting involved in. And so it was really interesting visiting Jürgen and Torsten, because they're producing these substrates, and we learnt the complexities of producing such a substrate for a range of different mushrooms. So Jürgen Nast is an expert on substrates that you're going to fruit your mushrooms on. So he gave us a quick tour of his facility, which is showing all of the sawdust that is outside fermenting, and he's turning the sawdust over, helping it to break down slightly, allowing the mycelium to get a better foothold when they try and break it down in the bags. And so he shows the different sawdust that he's using. They're mostly using oak, and definitely hardwoods are the tree type that is preferred in mushroom cultivation because it has lower antifungal properties. So he's showing the different sawdust grades here. He has a coarse grade which allows a lot of airflow through the substrates, and then these sawdusts are then mixed with a range of nutrient types. So he uses several different nutrients depending on what the availability is in Europe at the time, and they're all mixed into this together and then loaded up into these bays here. And we were having a look at these, and you've got little bits of mixture of soy hull, you've got sunflower seeds, you've got flax husk, you've got all sorts of small components, which is basically creating a really great structure to your substrates, which is really, really important when you're trying to grow mycelium in the bags. And because if you have great structure, you'll get great mycelium, and then the customer will get great flushes from your mushroom blocks. Going across Europe, we visited a range of different spawn producers, and spawn is the material that you add, it's the culture you add to your substrates. And so we got to visit two main companies, Mycelia in Belgium and also Sylvan. And Sylvan had an operation in the Netherlands but also in France. Sylvan is one of the largest, if not the largest, spawn producer in the world, and they use a lot of patented technology to produce their spawn. So a number of these facilities we weren't able to produce any footage of, but we got to understand the complexity of producing spawn at scale. And because it's such a vital ingredient in gourmet mushroom production, you need to really have a strong understanding on sterilization and culturing techniques of the tissue cultures. And so by talking to these companies, we got to understand a bit more of this information. We also headed down to Switzerland and visited Fine Fungi, started by Patrick Romanas, who is one of the key figures in Europe for gourmet mushroom production and is one of the first growers of shiitake mushrooms in Europe. So we got to visit their facility where they use a number of specialty techniques to produce their substrates in volume and how they produce their large shiitake blocks. Patrick had some really unique ways of producing the shiitake and also a harvesting technique that we hadn't seen anywhere else. So you can see here these amazingly large shiitake blocks, much larger than we'd seen in Japan and other parts of Europe. And because they're so large, they're hard to handle. And so Patrick has designed this fruiting carousel, which allows you to put the mushroom block, skewer it, and then hang it on this carousel, and then allows you to spin the blocks, allowing you to easily harvest, and it allows the pickers to not have much strain when they're harvesting, because these blocks are around 10 plus kilos per block. We also saw something that was quite unique here at Fine Fungi, which is that they incubate their blocks completely in the dark. So they don't use any light in their incubation rooms because they consider light as a trigger for fruiting. and they want these blocks to incubate well. So we had to enter with red lights on our head so we could see what we were doing in the room, and it allows us to not disturb the mycelium, and they believe that this will give you larger and greater consistent flushes of mushrooms across shiitake, but also across a range of the different oyster species that we saw as well. And so they produce king oysters very consistently, and you can see from these images the amazing large crop of pins that are coming off the top of these blocks. So there's definitely something in this technique of not allowing light, because light can be a trick for fruiting, just as lower temperature and high humidity and oxygen also triggers mushrooms to fruit. Light also does, and so they take that seriously, and the blocks don't get any light until they hit the fruiting rooms here. Across in the US, we've got to visit a range of different mushroom farms, but also facilities that are producing the components for these mushroom farms. We got to visit Cap and Stem, North Spore, and Field and Forest, and these aren't fruiting fresh mushrooms, but they're producing the materials and also the spawn on a small scale to support this network of smaller mushroom farms. So we visited Joe at Field and Forest, and he's showing off his spawn production here, where he's hydrating his oats to the correct consistency before they're sterilized. And so they're supporting a lot of small mushroom farms around the States, but also they're selling to the growing demand for at-home growers, that people want to grow their own mushrooms at home. And so they produce a whole range of different mushroom myceliums, much more than the large players do, because they're trying to cater to a whole variety of retail customers. And you can see here all the different bags on the shelving here, which is consistently sold through their online platform. And so they're thinking about how to ship their orders out, and they've got deliveries coming out the back, and all of their products are listed online and people go and purchase them. And so they're thinking about how to package their products to make it the best for postage reasons. So they squeeze the air out of their spawn bags, as you can see on the table there, which allows them to not have a higher volume in the bag to allow for cheaper postage rates for at-home customers. So this business is very much supporting the growing demand. Alongside these facilities that are producing the materials for growing mushrooms, we also got to visit a number of mushroom farms, including 4-Star Mushrooms in Chicago. So these guys are producing their mushrooms behind these glass walls, trying to create an experience for people to come and see how mushrooms are grown, and trying to encourage more consumers at home to eat mushrooms and putting them through more restaurants. And so they're producing these amazing lion's mane mushrooms, but they're also growing these enoki mushrooms, and they were talking to us about the fine dining restaurants wanting very specific mushrooms, which is what they cater for. We also visited Smallhold, which has facilities in LA, Texas and New York, creating a network across the country. So Smallhold had the highest end technology for all of their growing rooms here. They've got computers set up to measure all the parameters, and so a very high-tech facility where they're growing a whole range of different species here. In this room they're growing the king oyster mushrooms, and so they got smaller rooms, and each room holds a single variety of mushrooms across their different facilities. As we're entering this room here, this is their oyster blocks. A lot of these blocks are much larger than you'll see typically in Japan and in Europe, and they're typically running on around a 5-kilo block. And the reason behind this is they believe that it gives more mushrooms. More substrate is more mushrooms, and you can see some big clusters here. So in America, they love to do everything bigger, and so you've got really big blocks and really big clusters of oyster mushrooms coming off these blocks. They also produce a lot of lion's mane mushrooms, a very popular mushroom across the world now due to its medicinal qualities, and they produce a whole range of different mushrooms popping out of these blocks here at the same time. So they're fulfilling the need for more and more lion's mane across the US with their production, and any excess they put through a drying machine and they dry off. So they're also trying to make sure they don't have any waste, and so they save their harvest through different drying techniques. And we also got to visit Far West Fungi in Moss Landing, California. So we met up with Carl Garome, and he is the lead grower here, and they are utilizing all Japanese technology over in the US to produce their mushroom blocks. And so they've got their ribbon mixers and their conveyor belts coming up to a filling machine here, and all of these parts are from Japan. So it was great to see the Japanese technology being used in another country. And they are growing a lot of their mushrooms in these black bags here. And so this is a very similar technique of not allowing light on the mycelium that we saw at Fine Fungi in Switzerland, but actually done via the plastic bag, so you don't have to have a dark room. So that was really interesting to see. And you can see here all the bags coming up ready to be sterilized in their autoclaves. Once sterilized and cooled down, they're then inoculated, and they've got a team of people behind the wall that are basically adding the grain spawn into the top of the bags, and then they're moved along the conveyor belt here. And they also utilize the technique of no light, and they believe it definitely allows for a greater pin set, but because they're using bags instead of having to keep the rooms dark, it allows for a better work environment where you don't have to always be worried about lighting. And here you can see the oyster mushrooms popping straight out of these bags here. So fantastic pin sets, really concentrated on the openings of these bags. So the light definitely has a factor. And you can see some amazing black pearl kings here, a hybrid mushroom coming out of these bags here. They also produce reishi mushrooms, so the Ganoderma genus, because of its medicinal qualities. They're one of the only large-scale farms in North America producing this. Most of it is coming out of Asia, but here you can see the reishi mushrooms being produced here, and they can get multiple flushes, like 6 or 7 flushes of mushrooms over about a 9 to 10 month period in this room. So they just allow that to happen. And so it was really great seeing these techniques being used in America to produce a whole range of different mushrooms, from the medicinal all the way through to your standard oyster mushrooms. One of the key overviews from visiting a lot of these farms around the world was that in a number of other countries, the way that they're expanding this industry is through a network of spawn producers, substrate producers, and mushroom farms. In Australia, there's a lack of this network, and so a small mushroom farm is having to produce most of the time their own spawn and their own substrates, and also fruit the mushrooms, and this is really stifling the growth of the gourmet mushroom industry. And so this is one of the similarities that we saw across the US and across also Europe, is that they've got a network of these different facilities, and these facilities work together to help grow the industry. So that is one of the key similarities between those areas of the world, and something that we need to develop in Australia to help grow the industry here. Also, the education of consumers to look beyond the button mushroom and explore other varieties of mushrooms through the supermarkets, through different cuisines, and through education. We find that more consumers overseas are becoming educated, particularly in Japan, where they're educated young about these different varieties of mushrooms, and it's evolved in their cuisine. In Australia, people generally just focus on the button mushroom, and so to help grow this industry, we need more education in this space to help consumers look at how they can grow their own mushrooms, but also once they have their own mushrooms, what do they do with them in their cuisines and their diets? So more education in this space is needed. Currently, the direction for the Australian industry is the large agaricus growers. That large industry is importing and substituting that industry with exotics from overseas. And so what we find is, to help develop a gourmet mushroom industry for Australia, we really need to have educated growers and facilities supporting that network. At the moment, we're seeing a lot of imports through substrate blocks, but also just as the fresh fruiting bodies are just brought in from overseas and are put through the markets. And so to help grow this industry, we need to be producing our own produce on our own soil. The future direction for the Australian gourmet mushroom industry is developing that network of growers that we've seen across Europe and we've seen across the United States, developing that strongly in Australia through supporting industries in spawn and substrate production. So that's the future direction that Little Acres is going to be moving into. We also need greater education for consumers on how to use these mushrooms in different cuisines, and also how fungi work in nature and how to grow your own mushrooms. We need to be educating Australians from an early age on how fungi work in their own environment, and they're a fantastic food to be able to grow yourself, not only to understand how fungi work, but also to consume them and eat them yourself. So we need more education in this space, because mushrooms are such a great food product to have Kids are really brought up with just the button mushrooms these days, and so as this industry starts to grow, the consumer demand is developing, and it's really being consumer led. We need, as the consumers are growing this industry, we need more supporting parts of the industry to help to fill the demand for this produce, and so that people can go to the supermarkets and confidently buy a range of different mushrooms for their cuisine and understand how they're grown and have them as part of their diet. So a lot of this information that we've gathered overseas, we brought back to Little Acre, and Little Acre is moving more towards an educational outfit, but also to produce those supporting industries like I was spoken about, the spawn production and also the growing materials. We find a lot of small mushroom farms are really in demand for this sort of product and high quality amounts of it. And so Little Acre is moving more towards this, but we're also exploring heavily our workshop facilities and our workshop offerings, and wanting to bring more school programs to the sector to allow kids to understand how fungi works in nature and how to grow their own produce. So we find that Little Acre, as we move towards the future, will be educating growers but also consumers on how to use fungi, grow fungi and eat fungi. So in conclusion, the Churchill Fellowship allowed me to undertake an amazing opportunity around the world to explore the gourmet mushroom industry. Got to see things that very few growers get to see, going through Japan, seeing those really unique setups and how they're creating and growing such specialty varieties, across Europe, visiting the largest spawn producers in the world, and also a range of different networks across the United States. So in conclusion, that repertoire of information is going to allow us to help develop an industry in Australia where we've got supporting networks to allow for more education with consumers and help to grow a section of the produce aisle that has traditionally just been dominated by one type of mushroom.